In the dense, humid jungles of the Pacific, Japanese soldiers had grown accustomed to the slow, grinding rhythm of war. Patrols moved cautiously, eyes scanning for any sign of American presence. Yet on this morning, something impossible unfolded before them. From the mist-shrouded horizon, a line of American planes appeared, engines roaring, descending with a precision that made every soldier freeze. They were landing, not on a pre-existing airfield, not on a carefully prepared strip of land, but on a runway that had not existed a week prior. The soldiers could scarcely comprehend it. Only days earlier, the site had been nothing but tangled undergrowth, mud, and the relentless press of the tropical forest. Now before their astonished eyes, steel and concrete seemed to rise from the earth, a perfectly leveled strip cutting through the greenery. There was no sound of massive construction equipment, no hint of weeks of labor. Yet the planes landed safely, one after another, as if the engineers had bent the laws of time and terrain itself. For those watching, disbelief was the first reaction. Fear followed quickly. The presence of a functional airstrip so close to the front lines meant that reinforcements, supplies, and deadly firepower could reach the Americans faster than ever imagined. The Japanese soldiers realized, with a sinking horror, that this was more than a tactical achievement. It was psychological warfare, a demonstration of speed, ingenuity, and dominance over the very land they had considered familiar. The question on every mind, soldier and officer alike, was simple. How? How could a runway appear in days, in the middle of a hostile jungle, without drawing detection? The answer, as it would soon become clear, was not brute force. There were no thousands of men laboring endlessly in the sun, no monumental machinery carving the earth apart. Instead, the Americans relied on a combination of innovation, modular engineering, and unyielding discipline, a methodology perfected over years of preparation and honed under the most extreme conditions. These engineers were a different breed of soldier. They did not fight on the front lines with rifles and grenades, but their weapons were no less deadly: bulldozers, prefabricated steel matting, and a mastery of logistics that allowed them to transform the impossible into reality. Each piece of steel laid down, each trench dug and compacted, was part of a choreography executed at breathtaking speed. Within 72 hours, a patch of jungle had been transformed into a fully operational airfield, ready to launch planes into the chaos of battle. And yet, the human element was just as critical. Exhaustion, heat, and the omnipresent threat of enemy action pressed against every worker. Morale was fragile, and the margin for error non-existent. But these men had learned to operate not only as engineers, but as a cohesive, disciplined force. Each decision, each movement was calculated with precision. The story of this runway was, in many ways, a story of resilience under impossible pressure, a testament to human ingenuity confronting the chaos of war. As the Japanese soldiers watched, unable to interfere, the airstrip became a symbol of inevitability. War had changed. The ground beneath their feet was no longer safe. The rules had shifted. And far from the front lines, American pilots taxied down the runway, their engines screaming, ready to strike with a speed that seemed supernatural. The secret, as the stunned observers would soon understand, was not brute strength. It was speed. It was innovation. It was grit. And as the first bombs dropped from the newly arrived aircraft, the reality of what had been achieved began to settle. In warfare, those who could adapt and build faster than their enemies would always hold the advantage. But what did it take to achieve this feat? How did the engineers organize, plan, and execute in the face of time, terrain, and relentless danger? The answer lay in the intersection of human endurance, tactical brilliance, and technical mastery, a combination that would soon shock not only the Japanese soldiers, but the entire world. The secret was not brute strength, but speed, innovation, and grit. The vastness of the Pacific Ocean was both a shield and a trap. For the Japanese Empire, it was a barrier that seemed to protect them, an endless stretch of blue water that made invasion appear impossible. Yet for the Americans, it was a challenge to be conquered, a problem demanding ingenuity, persistence, and speed. The island-hopping campaign, the cornerstone of Allied strategy in 1944-45, relied on a simple yet ruthless truth. Control the air, and you control the islands. Without airfields, fleets were blind, unable to scout enemy positions, supply troops, or strike at enemy strongholds. Every island not equipped with a runway was a fortress, inaccessible to fast-moving American aircraft. The Japanese believed that this logistical limitation was their greatest ally. Dense jungles, volcanic rock, and coral atolls were natural defenses. The enemy could not easily project air power across hundreds of miles of ocean. They calculated that the terrain itself would act as a shield, buying time to fortify, resupply, and prepare for the inevitable assault. On many islands, soldiers dug in, confident that nature had allied with strategy. They were wrong, because while the Japanese relied on the natural difficulties of terrain, the Americans had developed a hidden arsenal, one that was invisible to traditional reconnaissance. It was a force not measured in rifles, tanks, or ships, but in steel, manpower, and ingenuity, the engineers of the U.S. Army Air Forces. These men were the backbone of the island-hopping campaign. Their mission was deceptively simple. Wherever the Navy could reach, they could build an airstrip, and they could do it fast. Sometimes in as little as 72 hours, every operation was a test of logistics. Landing heavy equipment on a beach under enemy fire, leveling coral and sand into a compacted runway, installing prefabricated steel matting. Each step had to be precise. Delays could cost lives. Mistakes could cost the entire campaign. Yet despite the danger, the engineers pressed forward. Their work often went unseen, overshadowed by the spectacular battles fought in the air and at sea. But without them, the island-hopping strategy would have collapsed before it even began. It was a race against time, terrain, and enemy observation. Hurricanes of heat, torrential rain, and the ever-present threat of Japanese counterattacks created a pressure cooker of conditions. The engineers worked in teams, their hours measured not by the clock, but by the rising and setting of the sun. Each day brought new challenges, shifting tides, crumbling sand, and the unpredictability of the islands themselves. Yet in every case, innovation triumphed. Prefabricated steel planking allowed runways to appear almost magically, and heavy engineering equipment adapted to beaches and jungles where no road existed. The Japanese, watching from the tree line, could not grasp the magnitude of what was happening. They saw planes taking off where no runway should exist, and they assumed there had been weeks of preparation. They did not see the coordination, the relentless planning, the improvisation, or the sheer willpower driving every shovel, every bulldozer, every mat of steel. In their minds, geography was on their side. In reality, the Americans had a hidden army, one without rifles, and this army was about to rewrite the rules of warfare across the Pacific. Where the Japanese thought nature provided protection, innovation would deliver devastation. Every new strip of steel brought the front lines closer to their defenses, turning safe havens into launch pads for American dominance. But America had a hidden army, one without rifles. War is often remembered in terms of soldiers and battles, of rifles cracking and bombs raining down. Yet behind every advance, every captured island, there was another army, one not always visible but no less vital. They were the engineers of the Pacific, the men who turned chaos into order, mud into runways, and jungle into operational bases. Ordinary Americans, pulled from farms, factories, and small towns, were transformed into builders in combat. They became the backbone of the island-hopping campaign, the unseen force that enabled every marine advance, every aerial strike, every tactical success. These men were not just engineers. They were combat-ready soldiers, known as the Navy Seabees, construction battalions, and their army counterparts, they carried more than tools. They carried rifles, grenades, and the weight of expectation. Every operation demanded dual mastery, the ability to fight and the ability to construct under fire. On many islands, the front lines and construction sites were indistinguishable. Explosions could shatter the air as men poured concrete, leveled coral, or installed steel matting for airstrips. Mortar rounds might fall within yards, yet they continued. Precision, speed, and courage were all that separated life from death. Their mission was deceptively simple: follow the Marines, secure the terrain, and make it livable. Fast. They had to transform every island into a functional base of operations within days. Beaches became supply depots. Forests were cleared for airfields. Caves were reinforced for storage and shelter. Every decision mattered. Miscalculate the soil's capacity, and a runway could crumble under the weight of a fully loaded bomber. Misjudge the tide, and an essential landing strip could be washed away before it ever saw a plane. Yet the Seabees thrived in uncertainty, improvising solutions with tools at hand and sheer ingenuity. Training for these men was relentless. They drilled in both construction and combat simultaneously, learning to switch instantly between wielding a rifle and a bulldozer. They were taught to think like soldiers and build like engineers. In the Pacific, there was no margin for error, no do-over. Every obstacle, volcanic rock, dense jungle, coral reefs, was met with adaptive problem-solving. Prefabricated steel matting allowed runways to spring up where sand or rock would have made construction impossible. Heavy machinery, often modified on the spot, carved paths through jungle and swamp with a speed that astonished both allies and enemies. The psychological burden was enormous. These men were constantly exposed to danger, exhaustion, and the raw unpredictability of war. Their workdays were measured not in hours, but in tasks completed. Every runway, every supply depot, every cleared area a small victory against the chaos of the Pacific. And yet, in the midst of this physical and mental strain, camaraderie flourished. The Seabees depended on one another for survival. Each man's skill, judgment, and endurance could mean the difference between success and disaster. Their proving ground would be merciless. Each island was a new test, each mission a crucible of fire and logistics. Japanese fortifications, hidden snipers, and treacherous terrain combined to make every task a gamble. Yet despite the odds, the Seabees and Army Engineers delivered. Within 72 hours, airstrips appeared where none should have existed. Bases were operational before the enemy even realized what had happened. Ordinary men, thrust into extraordinary circumstances, had become the architects of American dominance in the Pacific, and their proving ground would be one of the most brutal battles in the Pacific. The island of Guadalcanal, sweltering and unrelenting, became a stage for one of the most extraordinary feats of wartime engineering. Henderson Field, the airstrip that would prove pivotal for control of the South Pacific, lay in ruins, scarred by relentless Japanese bombardment. Every day explosions shook the earth, and the air reeked of smoke and diesel. Yet amidst the chaos, a singular determination took hold. The runway must endure, must function, must survive. American engineers and Marines moved in a precise, synchronized rhythm, each aware that failure was fatal. By night, Marines patrolled and fought, pushing back Japanese attacks with grit and discipline. By day, the engineers poured concrete, laid steel planking, and repaired craters made by shells that had torn through what little remained of the airfield. It was a brutal, exhausting cycle, combat intertwined with construction, survival bound to every calculated effort of the human hand. The Japanese watched with disbelief. Over and over, they attempted to neutralize Henderson Field, believing that repeated bombardment would render it unusable. Each strike created fresh devastation, craters, shattered equipment, twisted steel. And yet, with a stubbornness that seemed almost supernatural, the airfield rose again. Soldiers whispered its nickname with awe and frustration, the airfield that would not die. It was a place where human endurance met tactical necessity. where the line between engineering and heroism blurred. The challenges were not merely technical. Guadalcanal's tropical climate, with torrential rains and oppressive heat, tested the limits of human endurance. Concrete had to be mixed, leveled, and cured under conditions that would break ordinary men. Steel mats had to be fastened over muddy, unstable ground. Every decision had consequences. Miscalculate drainage, and rain would wash away hours of labor. Misjudged structural support, and a fully loaded plane could collapse the surface mid-takeoff. Yet the engineers adapted, innovating under pressure. Prefabricated solutions, improvised leveling techniques, and sheer brute determination kept the runway operational against impossible odds. Psychologically, the burden was immense. Each blast, each night attack carried the weight of mortality. Men who built had to fight. Men who fought had to rebuild. Sleep became a luxury. Fear a constant companion. Yet the engineers thrived on their discipline and training. They understood that speed and resilience were their weapons against chaos. Their work was not glamorous, but it was decisive. Without Henderson Field, the island could not be held. Without the engineers, the Marines' efforts would have been futile. The story of Guadalcanal is a story of persistence. It is the tale of men who refused to yield, who understood that the survival of a single airstrip could shape the fate of the Pacific. Yet as remarkable as their endurance was, it was not enough. The next phase of the war demanded not just persistence, but speed. Battles could not wait for slow, methodical repair. Entire islands needed to be seized, airstrips constructed, and supply lines established in days, sometimes hours. The stage was set for the next monumental test of engineering under fire, one where delay could mean disaster. And innovation would become the difference between life and death. But if Guadalcanal proved persistence, the next challenge demanded speed. In the heart of the Pacific, a remote, uncharted coral island awaited its destiny. Dense jungle clung stubbornly to volcanic rock, and coral reefs fringed the beaches like jagged teeth. To most, it was inhospitable, impossible, a place where human ambition would falter. But for the U.S. Navy's Seabees and Army Engineers, it was a challenge to be mastered. Their mission was audacious: build a fully operational airstrip, capable of supporting fighter planes and bombers. In just 72 hours, the operation began before dawn. Under a sky heavy with the threat of tropical storms and Japanese reconnaissance flights, landing craft disgorged bulldozers, graders, and tons of steel, matting onto the narrow beaches. Soldiers and engineers moved with precision, almost choreography, racing against time and nature. Every step was calculated. Every error could cost hours or lives. Yet despite the weight of machinery, the fatigue of travel, and the ever-present enemy, the men worked as one organism, driven by purpose and discipline. Jungle trees were felled, their roots ripped from the earth as coral and soil were leveled with relentless efficiency. Heavy bulldozers carved pathways through vegetation, while graders smoothed the surface into precise contours. Prefabricated steel matting, interlocking panels that could bear the weight of aircraft, was transported, aligned, and bolted into place. Engineers worked in shifts day and night, pushing beyond exhaustion. The roar of engines, the grind of metal, the shouts of coordination filled the island, a symphony of determination against the natural chaos. Every step was a race against time. Rain could wash away progress. Shifting tides threatened the coral foundation, and the constant possibility of Japanese air attack loomed overhead. Yet these men, trained for both combat and construction, pressed forward, adapting to each obstacle with improvisation that seemed instinctual. Sandbags became temporary levees. Makeshift drainage channels diverted water away from the steel planks. Every tool was repurposed to solve the next urgent problem. The Japanese, watching from hidden vantage points, could scarcely believe their eyes. Where they had expected jungle and coral to stall the Americans for weeks, a functioning airstrip appeared in days. From the tree line, they saw bulldozers glide across flattened earth, men carrying steel panels with relentless efficiency, and engineers moving as though the island itself had bent to their will. Panic and disbelief mingled in their ranks. This was not brute force, not a conventional attack. It was innovation made visible, speed made tangible. By the third day, the runway was operational. Fighter planes rolled down the steel matting, engines screaming as they lifted into the sky. Bombers followed, their weight testing the ingenuity of prefabricated panels and careful grading. Supply ships docked, unloading fuel, ammunition, and troops who would make the island a forward base for future operations. Within 72 hours, what had been an uninhabitable, hostile land was transformed into a strategic hub. The psychological impact on both sides was profound. For the Americans, it was a demonstration of mastery over nature and circumstance, proof that preparation, ingenuity, and human endurance could conquer any obstacle. For the Japanese, it was a moment of stark realization. No terrain was safe, no natural barrier impenetrable. The rules of warfare had shifted. Speed, innovation, and technical skill now determined dominance as much as firepower or numbers. Yet even as planes lifted and the island buzzed with activity, commanders knew this was only the beginning. The success of 72 hours demonstrated what was possible, but the Pacific War was far from over. Every new island posed fresh challenges, each more complex and dangerous than the last. The techniques, discipline, and courage displayed here would be tested again and again, in environments no less hostile and enemies no less determined. The miracle of 72 hours was only the beginning. In the Pacific, every inch of land carried a strategic weight. The difference between a failed landing and a decisive strike could be a matter of feet, minutes, or ingenuity. Enter Marsden matting, pierced steel planking, or PSP, a technological marvel that would redefine warfare in the Pacific theater. On paper, it was simple: steel sheets with holes punched in precise patterns, designed to interlock and distribute weight evenly. In practice, it was revolutionary, turning coral-strewn beaches, jungles, and swampy islands into instant runways capable of supporting the heaviest Allied aircraft. Before PSP, engineers relied on leveling sand or coral, compacting soil, and improvising with local materials. Methods slow, laborious, and often unreliable under tropical storms. With steel matting, construction speed increased exponentially. A 72-hour airstrip became not an extraordinary feat, but a repeatable strategy. Bulldozers leveled the ground, and panels were laid like puzzle pieces, forming a surface strong enough to withstand bombers, fighters, and cargo planes. Every mat anchored a foothold for American power, a tiny steel bridge across the chaos of the Pacific. The Seabees became masters of this technology. Teams synchronized movements to carry, align, and bolt each panel into place. Shifts ran round the clock, often under enemy observation or fire. The process demanded precision. A misaligned panel could cripple a plane's landing, or worse, bring a fully loaded bomber down in a spray of coral and steel. Yet the engineers worked with remarkable efficiency, their training and coordination turning uncertainty into order. Within days, an island that had been considered inaccessible became a hub for American air dominance. The psychological and strategic impact was immediate. Japanese commanders, who had assumed dense forests, jagged coral, and tidal beaches would slow the Allies, found themselves confronted by a force that could materialize air power almost anywhere. Entire islands, once thought safe from attack, suddenly faced airstrikes, reconnaissance, and supply runs that had once required weeks of planning. For the Americans, Marsden matting didn't just speed construction. It compressed the battlefield, turning vast distances into manageable operations. The Pacific shrank under the weight of steel and ingenuity. Flying fortresses, the B-17s and B-24s, soon rumbled down these new runways. Their heavy fuselages tested the limits of PSP, yet each landing and takeoff reinforced its reliability. Fighters followed, strafing and supporting ground operations, their presence extending the reach of American strategy. Entire campaigns depended on this technology. Without it, the logistics of island hopping would have been insurmountable. With it, the Allies gained the ability to strike first, strike hard, and control the tempo of the war. In essence, Marsden matting was more than steel. It was freedom, mobility, and tactical supremacy condensed into interlocking panels. Each sheet laid was a declaration of intent: no jungle too dense, no beach too treacherous, no island too remote. With every new airstrip, the war's geography shifted in favor of those who could innovate fastest. With this invention, the Pacific suddenly seemed much smaller. Airstrips were only the beginning. On each captured island, American engineers transformed inhospitable terrain into self-sustaining forward bases, miniature factories of war. These were not mere landing sites. They were complex, interlocking systems designed to support sustained operations far from home. Hospitals were constructed from prefabricated materials, ready to receive casualties even as combat raged nearby. Fuel depots stored the lifeblood of mechanized warfare, allowing planes and vehicles to strike farther and faster than the enemy anticipated. Supply roads carved through dense jungle connected beaches to command posts, runways, and storage sites. Each island became a floating fortress, a hub of mobility, power projection, and psychological dominance. The scale of these operations stunned Japanese forces. Where once a small contingent could control a remote island by virtue of geography alone, they now faced a sprawling, fortified network capable of launching coordinated attacks and sustaining prolonged campaigns. The meticulous work of engineers revealed a truth that the enemy could not ignore. America's industrial power had become mobile and its reach seemingly limitless. Captured supply caches and observation posts revealed not only vast quantities of fuel, ammunition, and food, but also the systematic planning that had gone into making these islands functional almost overnight. Each base was a microcosm of American efficiency, discipline, and ingenuity. The Seabees and Army Engineers operated under constant pressure, constructing while under threat of attack. Air raids and sniper fire were not anomalies. They were part of the daily rhythm. Yet the engineers pressed on, understanding that speed and completeness were as vital as firepower. Hospitals had to be ready to treat casualties the moment the first wounded arrived. Fuel depots had to be positioned for rapid distribution, yet protected from potential sabotage. Roads had to endure tropical downpours, heavy vehicles, and constant foot traffic, all while traversing coral, mud, and dense undergrowth. Every structure, every plan, every nail or bolt was part of a larger strategic calculation. The psychological impact on the Japanese was profound. Patrols that once roamed islands unchallenged now found themselves confronting an enemy that could strike with mobility, sustain itself indefinitely, and repair or rebuild almost instantly. Observation posts reported the relentless rhythm of construction, runways appearing overnight, fortified positions rising where none had existed, hospitals and supply depots ensuring the Americans could fight longer, harder, and farther than anticipated. These engineers were not just building, they were projecting the industrial might of a continent across the vast Pacific in real time with deadly precision. As each island became operational, a pattern emerged. The noose was tightening around Japan. Every base constructed allowed faster deployment of troops and aircraft, shortened supply lines, and created launch points for subsequent operations. The Pacific, once an expanse offering natural protection, had become a grid of American mobility, each node reinforcing the next. The engineers' work amplified every tactical advantage, ensuring that victory was not just a matter of weapons, but of infrastructure. Foresight and adaptability. Every hospital built, every fuel depot stocked, every road cleared contributed to a single, relentless objective: to bring the fight closer to Japan, compress the theater of war, and remove the illusion of safety that geography once provided. In their hands, engineering became a weapon, logistics became strategy, and each island a fortress of inevitability. And with every island built up, the noose tightened on Japan. The beaches of Leyte and the volcanic slopes of Iwo Jima were defined by fire, smoke, and the deafening roar of artillery. For most soldiers, survival was a matter of skill, instinct, and courage. For the U.S. engineers, survival meant building the very platforms that would allow the Marines and airmen to continue the fight. Their task was brutal: construct airfields under direct enemy fire, often while the ground itself shook from the detonation of shells, bombs, and grenades. Bulldozers rumbled like tanks across scorched earth, pushing earth, coral, and rubble, carving pathways not only for steel matting, but for the advance of entire military campaigns. On Leyte, engineers faced relentless Japanese counterattacks as they worked to repair and expand runways, critical for supply lines. Mortar rounds fell like rain, tearing craters into newly leveled terrain. Men dug, poured concrete, and laid steel planking, while smoke and shrapnel filled the air. Each successful panel of steel was a fragile victory, each completed runway section a lifeline. One Seabee, writing home in a rare moment of reprieve, described the air as thick with sweat, fear, and the smell of burning wood and oil. We were building life while staring into death. Iwo Jima presented an even more merciless challenge. Jagged volcanic rock, ash, and entrenched enemy positions made every step a calculated risk. Bulldozers and graders became weapons of war in their own right, barreling forward under the threat of snipers and artillery, shaping the terrain for planes that would eventually strike the Japanese mainland. Engineers lived in the open, exposed to fire that claimed dozens of their comrades, yet they pressed on. Personal diaries recall soldiers supporting each other through exhaustion, witnessing acts of quiet heroism, one man holding a steel panel steady while another secured it, under the shadow of falling shells. Another recounts digging trenches for wounded, while simultaneously directing a bulldozer into position for runway extension. Their work was both mechanical and profoundly human, an intricate balance of skill, courage, and sacrifice. These operations illustrated a harsh reality. Victory was inseparable from infrastructure. Each runway laid, each supply depot built, each road cleared brought the fight closer to the Japanese heartland. Engineers became the unsung frontline combatants, often enduring as much, if not more, danger than infantry. Yet their presence allowed the Marines to advance with confidence, knowing that logistics, medical support, and air cover would arrive without delay. By the time the sun set over Iwo Jima's blackened landscape, the engineers had transformed an island designed to resist invasion into a functional military hub. Airstrips that should have taken weeks, perhaps months, to construct appeared in days, supporting fighters and bombers, delivering ammunition, food, and reinforcements to the front. The human cost was steep, but the strategic payoff undeniable. Their legacy was written in concrete and steel, in the silent testimony of runways stretching into the Pacific sunset, and in the stories of men who refused to stop, even when everything around them screamed to retreat. Every island taken, every airfield completed under fire, became a monument to resilience, ingenuity, and sacrifice. But the final act would bring the engineers' legacy to its peak. By 1945, the Pacific War had become a testament to speed, innovation, and endurance. Yet no challenge tested the U.S. engineers more than Okinawa. The island was not just another stepping stone, it was a gateway to the Japanese homeland, a prize of immense strategic importance. Its capture demanded not only combat, but construction on a scale previously unseen in the theater of war. The objective was clear: establish massive air bases fast enough to launch the B-29 superfortresses that could strike Japan directly, bringing the fight to the very heart of the empire. The operation began with an unprecedented influx of men and machinery. Bulldozers, graders, steel matting, and prefabricated structures poured onto beaches scarred by mines, artillery, and the remnants of volcanic terrain. Engineers faced an environment more unforgiving than any they had encountered. Typhoons threatened progress, hills of coral and ash slowed mechanized equipment, and Japanese fortifications made every foot of ground contested. Yet the Seabees and Army Engineers, hardened by years of island-hopping campaigns, moved with precision, discipline, and an almost uncanny speed. Airstrips rose from the earth as if conjured by magic. Teams worked in shifts around the clock, coordinating the delivery of steel, concrete, and heavy equipment. Runways capable of supporting fully loaded B-29 bombers stretched across once hostile beaches, while supply depots, fuel storage, hospitals, and command centers formed a network that allowed sustained operations at unprecedented scale. Every decision, every bolt, every panel of steel mattered. Errors could delay aircraft, compromise safety, or expose personnel to lethal risk, yet engineers pressed forward, adapting in real time to shifting conditions, enemy interference, and the unpredictable rhythms of nature. Japanese commanders, observing the transformation, were horrified. Islands that should have provided sanctuary and time to regroup were being converted into powerful American bases almost overnight. The scale of construction, the speed at which it occurred, and the integration of these bases into broader strategic objectives were unlike anything the Japanese had anticipated. Where geography and distance had once served as barriers, engineers turned them into assets, reshaping the theater of war and projecting power farther than conventional forces alone could achieve. The human cost was immense, yet the engineers' discipline and camaraderie carried them through exhaustion, tropical storms, and constant threat of attack. Bulldozers became as vital as tanks, their rumble across the terrain signaling both construction and dominance. Men who once labored quietly in the shadows of battle were now at the center of a transformation that would define the final months of the Pacific War. Their work was as tactical as it was technical. Every runway, depot, and road extended the reach of American strategy and brought victory incrementally closer. By the end of the campaign, Okinawa had become a fortress of steel, concrete, and human determination. B-29s roared down newly minted runways, launching strikes that would strike fear deep within Japan's military command. The island, once a natural stronghold for the Japanese, had been reshaped into a launch pad for the final act of the war. Engineers had taken raw terrain, chaos, and danger, and molded them into instruments of strategic power. The Empire realized the Americans could build war itself into existence. Across the vast expanse of the Pacific, from the coral-strewn beaches of Guadalcanal to the volcanic slopes of Iwo Jima and the typhoon-battered plains of Okinawa, a silent army reshaped the course of history. The U.S. engineers and Navy Seabees were not always celebrated on the front pages of newspapers or in the headlines of wartime dispatches. Yet their work, precise, relentless, and unforgiving, created the infrastructure that made victory possible. More than 400 airstrips would rise across the Pacific Islands, each one a testament to discipline, ingenuity, and the indomitable human spirit. The story of these runways was more than an engineering triumph. It was a psychological one. They embodied the fusion of American industrial capability and individual grit, proving that even in the harshest environments, speed, innovation, and preparation could overcome obstacles that seemed insurmountable. Islands that should have been isolated, fortified, and untouchable were transformed into launch pads for fighters, bombers, and supply aircraft. Every mile of steel matting laid, every runway leveled from jungle or coral, compressed the Pacific theater, bringing the Allies closer to the Japanese mainland with each passing day. The 72-hour airstrip had become both a symbol and a strategy. On remote islands, soldiers watched in awe as engineers and Seabees turned raw terrain into operational hubs overnight. Bulldozers carved the jungle, graders smoothed coral, and steel panels interlocked with precision, creating surfaces capable of sustaining the weight of the heaviest bombers. These feats were achieved under blistering heat, pouring rain, and the ever-present threat of enemy fire. Human endurance, technical mastery, and tactical coordination converged in a spectacle of purpose and determination that would define the Pacific Campaign. Yet the significance of these runways extended beyond their immediate tactical function. They represented adaptability, the ability to turn challenges into opportunities. Where geography and distance had once favored the defenders, American engineers redefined the battlefield itself. Islands that were once thought unreachable became bases of attack. Airstrips and supply depots multiplied operational options, allowing rapid movement of troops, fuel, and ordnance. Each successful construction project forced the enemy to adapt, retreat, or face destruction. The engineers' work transformed logistics into a weapon as powerful as any cannon or fighter plane. Even today, the psychological resonance of their achievement remains. The Seabees' legacy is one of resilience under pressure, of preparation, anticipating chaos, of hidden strength made manifest through action. They remind us that warfare is not only fought with guns and bombs, but with vision, coordination, and the quiet heroism of those who toil where few notice, yet whose work decides the fate of nations. As the Pacific Campaign drew to a close, these runways became monuments, not of stone or steel alone, but of human ingenuity and endurance. The 72-hour miracles were replicated again and again, each one compressing time and distance, enabling the Allies to project power across thousands of miles of ocean. By the war's end, the cumulative impact of these efforts had turned the tide, allowing victory to be won not only on the battlefield but on the airstrips that connected them. In the vast, chaotic theater of the Pacific War, it was easy to see only the bombs, the bullets, and the bloodshed. Yet behind every advance, every air raid, every strike on the Japanese mainland were runways, conceived, constructed, and perfected by ordinary men performing extraordinary feats. They were the arteries of victory, carrying the lifeblood of strategy, supply, and firepower across islands that had once seemed unreachable. In the Pacific War, bombs and bullets won battles, but runways won the war.